American cities used to be kind of an example of American industrialization, of finance, of arts and entertainment. In fact, American cities were something to be envied the world over. And yet, it seems like for multiple decades now, many of our biggest cities have been in somewhat of a decline. That's not to say it's been consistent the entire time, but I think most people would agree that on some level, our cities seem a little bit less grand than they used to be, whether it's issues of crime, economics, homelessness, you name it. There's problems. There's significant problems. And the question is, why? Is this just the nature of cities? Because it's not even a problem exclusive to the United States. Or are there other reasons? Well, today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at 5 major U.S. cities within the United States, and we're going to ask some important questions about what's happened. Why are many of these places that you wouldn't want to go on vacation to? They're not places that you would feel comfortable allowing your kids to just roam down the street and look at various monuments or shops. Why did this take place? And can it be corrected? All that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Beat.
Hello, everyone.
Then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How are you, Christian?
I'm doing well.
Okay, let's jump right into this. All right, so for the framing, we're going to take a look at some various crises that have been impacting some major American cities. And we're just going to ask the question, like, okay, kind of what happened? So to give everyone on the same sheet of music, Christian, take us away.
So in case you're not aware, cities aren't really doing that well in the U.S. right now. Now, you could argue that some of them haven't been doing well for,
some Detroit is
whole lifetimes, right?
But Detroit's become like the primary example of a city that was once like grand and wealthy and prosperous and expanding, and now,
bombed out ghost town.
There's a popular meme where it shows Hiroshima in 1945, Detroit in 1945, and then Hiroshima today and Detroit today, and it's pretty depressing when you consider that we dropped an atomic bomb in Hiroshima.
So, what we're going to go through today is a list of 5 different crises that are facing different cities in the U.S. And we've got one city that will kind of serve as an archetype for each of these. Mm-hmm. Now, I would argue one of these cities in particular actually kind of serves as an archetype of all of them, but we'll get to that. And then we'll talk about why is that? What is actually going on with some of these cities? And is it even theoretically possible that you could fix some of these things? What would you have to do to fix the crisis of some of these cities?
And so to put this in the proper perspective, you're not saying that like we're going to pick a particular thing, crime, mismanagement, whatever it is, and we're going to say, look, this city is an example of that thing. You're not saying those other cities that we mentioned don't deal with like crime and other stuff, but
there's a lot of overlap.
There's unique characteristics that determine why you chose which cities for which, problems or crises. So, all right, what's our first one?
So our first example here is government mismanagement.
Okay, so deliberate government incompetence, corruption.
This should not be surprising. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly since the election last November, about blue state and blue city incompetency being one of the things that led to Trump's victory, and in particular, Trump's unique gains in blue America. Yeah. The parts of the U.S. that shifted we didn't see this in the electoral map because of, winner take all electoral votes, right? But the states and the cities that had the biggest shift to the right in 2024 were the bluest parts of the country. New York State shifted like 10 points to the right, basically.
Well, and I want to give you a lot of credit for this. When we looked at, when you told me what you described as the donut effect, which is the suburbs are becoming more blue, the rural areas are red, and now the inner cities are getting more conservative. That seemed ridiculous when you looked at electoral maps. But then you poured over the very specific data and you found out, you look at New York City, and you look at the 5 boroughs. The primary one that used to be the most conservative was Manhattan. Manhattan's gotten bluer, and every single other borough, that's right, Queens, right, the Bronx, have gotten more conservative. Now, they're still overwhelmingly left, but they've gotten more conservative. So when it looks at government mismanagement, what city do you kind of look at as the pinnacle of government mismanagement.
So this one should not be terribly surprising.
Yeah.
I've picked Chicago.
Okay, why
Now,
Chicago?
you could actually argue, Christian, you're wrong. It's not government mismanagement. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're all incredibly corrupt. And you'd be right. You'd be right. Chicago's infamous for, its machine politics. It's incredibly corrupt politicians. In Illinois, they have this tradition that there's a greater than 50% chance that the governor will end up in prison at some point. If you look at all of the governors since I think like 2000 or the 1990s, I can't remember. It's in the last like 20 to 30 years. Almost all of them have gone to prison, and most of them have come out of the Chicago metro area. Now, when you look at the state legislature, you get the same thing, right? Obviously, the Democratic Party runs Illinois. Well, the overwhelming majority of their legislators are coming out of out of Chicagoland, basically. You get the same thing in Congress all the time. It's like it's usually about every 10 years or so, you get some sort of congressional scandal involving a Democrat congressman from Chicago. This happened in the 1990s. This happened with Jesse Jackson Jr. about 10, 15 years ago. In fact, we're probably due for one now.
Kelsey Grammer did there was a video, or there was a series a while back, and it was kind of rough, but he was the mayor of Chicago. And again, it's made for TV, but part of the role of it was to kind of illuminate just how corrupt city government could be with the unions and the police force and the ombudsman and everything else. And it was, again, it's a TV show, so I don't say it's reality, but there's a reason why they picked Chicago.
Yeah. So, but on the mismanagement side, like corruption is one thing, and you can say that it's related to just incompetency and mismanagement. Maybe those are kind of the product of government corruption. But in the case of Chicago, it's kind of interesting because they've gone very progressive with their politics lately. It's not just Democrat machine anymore. That's been in place for 60, 70
daily
years.
Machine and everything
but
else.
They've intentionally gone out there and started electing avowed progressives, not just, boilerplate Democrats. So their current mayor is, in many respects, kind of similar to Zohran Mamdani in New York. Brandon Johnson, who's the current mayor, he's basically a Marxist. He certainly identifies as a progressive. And he defeated the more moderate Democrat in the runoff election in 2023 it was a relatively close race, but he's by far and away the most left-wing mayor that Chicago has ever seen. And he also has depending on the poll, anywhere from a 25% to 6% approval rating.
And what do you think is the main impetus of the latest lowest approval rating?
So here's a story that I got pulled up here. Okay, so here's the highest one. Sorry,
26.
His high end.
26.
That's his high end, by the way. 26. Yeah. I saw one poll that showed him at 6%. Now, what's interesting is that there's a reason for it. And the reason, by the way, there's people that are arguing that New York City might end up in the same situation, right? They might elect this darling of the progressive socialist left, and he might end up like Brandon Johnson. He's described as the worst mayor in America right now. And you have people that voted for him, like this lady who's now like turned against him and is now like, you get normal people in Chicago that are like showing up at town halls that are protesting. Well, part of the reason that the general public has turned so hard against him, and it's not this article that has it, it's actually this one, is because of the way that he's managed the city government and the city budget. So here's an example for you. Brandon Johnson's approval rating has tanked in large part, or at least in part, because Chicago spent $600 million to house 50,000 illegal immigrants in the city. So you have these people that are showing up to city council meetings, outraged, and for good reason, for the fact that they're looking at the city budget and they're saying, you're spending over $500 million housing illegal immigrants who can't even vote for you, and you're setting aside basically the public that actually elected the city council, the mayor, the Cook County Board of Supervisors, right? All these people. Like, this is a prime example right here of kind of like where the priorities are with the city government. They've declared themselves to be a sanctuary city, so obviously when illegal immigrants cross the border, and we saw this a few years ago, Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis did the same thing in Florida. They were shipping these illegal immigrants to, okay, great, you want to be a sanctuary city? We'll send you all your illegal immigrants then. And so they're showing up by the busload in places like New York City and in Chicago. And what are they doing? They're not sending them back. They're not sending them away. No, that's what the liberals do in Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
Instead, they're like, we'll put you up in hotels. We'll give you credit cards.
Yeah.
We'll give you free money.
Well, and this is the distinction here, right? When Mayor Daley was running Chicago, Chicago wasn't any less corrupt, and it wasn't any less of a political machine. The difference is that Daley was also kind of a law and order person. When race riots were happening all over the country, Mayor Daley was famous as a Democrat mayor for saying, "I've given my police instructions, shoot to kill." And it turns out Chicago didn't have the same sort of riots that you saw in other places as a result. And so there was this idea that, yeah, it's machine politics. Yeah, it's corrupt, but, they get the important things done and they keep the peace. Well, the difference is that wasn't liberal or progressive enough for people. And after BLM and after George Floyd and everything else, it was this idea that
progressives hijacked the machine.
What all of these, because again, one of the things progressives have gotten very, very good at is when there's a machine in place, they take it over. Well, they took it over and Daley would give a lot of lip service to certain things, but then also understood the way the world really worked, right? Rahm Emanuel would give a lot of lip service to certain things, but understood how the world really worked. Brandon Johnson was a true believer. And so when he said diversity is our strength, he didn't just mean it as a campaign line. He meant it as, no, this is absolutely what we're going to do in Chicago. And the end result is it costs you hundreds of billions of dollars. Crime goes up. You can't seem to deal with any of the issues that you promised to along the lines of education. And it becomes, again, you have an already corrupt system with a political machine running it, getting taken over by progressives who honestly believe that everything that they say works. And then when they implement it 2 years down the line, you can't hide from reality. Because the other thing that they can't claim is they don't have control. Yes, they do.
They have no opposition.
And that's the thing that voters are also realizing. It's like, wait a second, you sold us this utopian bill of goods and you're not delivering on it. So Chicago is the example of government mismanagement for kind of all of those reasons. What's the next city?
So the next city that we've got up here is the murder capital of the United States, and that is St. Louis.
Wow.
So St. Louis has a murder rate of almost 70 per 10,000.
Wow.
To put that into perspective, if St. Louis was an independent nation, it would be the murder capital of the world.
Yeah, St. Louis makes Baltimore look safe if you're looking for a comparison, because St. Louis murder rate is 69.4 per 100,000. Baltimore is 51.1.
To give you an idea of how bad it is,
20 points less.
St. Louis has a murder rate more than double
Memphis.
Yeah. And Memphis is like infamous in the South for being. Memphis is like considered usually tied with New Orleans up here as like the murder capital of the South.
This is also important too, because a lot of times you'll get the left saying like, oh, actually the most dangerous violent areas in the country.
Yeah, they're all in red states.
They're all in red states, Missouri, Louisiana, Ohio,
yeah,
Tennessee,
they're blue voters.
Tennessee, but it's all the bluest areas of the red states. But okay, so St. Louis is the murder cat. Any additional analysis on that?
So,
one?
I mean, the point that I want to get across here is crime.
Yeah.
So remember, I'm using archetypes here. I'm not saying that other cities don't have a government mismanagement problem, right? Chicago's the embodiment of that, but there's other cities that do that as well, right? There's other cities on here that have a huge crime problem. We know that Baltimore has a crime problem.
Well, and Chicago also makes the top 10 when it comes to murder rate.
We know that Detroit, they're going to show up in a minute. Spoiler alert. They have a crime problem, right?
Yeah.
Cleveland, like a lot of these cities have crime problems. I just used St. Louis as an example because they're uniquely, I mean, look at this.
Yeah, that's a massive murder rate.
Compared to, I'm surprised that the governor of Missouri hasn't just sent in the National Guard at this point.
Well, to give you an idea, out of the top 10 list, right, Chicago's 10th on murder rate. St. Louis has a murder rate about 3 times, almost 3 times what Chicago is. So when we say the murder capital of the world, they really have done a lot to earn that title, right? That's not just passing. All right, so we got mismanagement, Chicago, crime and specifically murder, St. Louis. What's the third one?
Well, I just hinted at it a minute ago, and that's Detroit. I don't have a link because I don't need one.
And that's economic
collapse.
Yeah.
The reason I don't have any links for this is because it should be very self-explanatory.
Yeah.
In 1950, Detroit had about 1.6 million people. It's lost 1 million people since then.
Yeah.
2/3 of its population have just moved out.
Well, and Detroit,
and the reason for it is because the economy's collapsed there.
well, Detroit used to be, I think, either the first or second wealthiest city in
It was
America.
one of the richest parts of America.
Yeah, if when you look at the 30s, the 40s, it was on the up and up, 50s too, but you had a significant change in leadership taking place, I think, in the late 40s, 50s, and then the 60s
is when it
especially.
solidified.
60s when it solidified because you had the Great Society come in and you had this federalization of a lot of like government funds and things like that. And it just
And the decline of the
significantly
auto
altered.
industry that took place in the 70s and 80s. And then again, the 2008 crash really hurt Michigan. The auto industry experienced two crashes, one in the 70s and 80s, and then the other one in the 2000s, right? After 2008.
Well, Detroit became famous for just like wild animals like roaming. I mean,
as we're
Speaking of links.
looking at these, can you also make sure your links are centered so the audience can see them well?
Yes, some of these are hard to do, but you have got to see Detroit from space. Look at this. This is Google Maps of Detroit.
yeah.
If you zoom in here. Okay, so here we've got this pulled up. And Nate, you're going to have to cut the rest of that stuff that showed the address of this house and the final cut. Okay, so here's Detroit from, from space, basically. This is Google Maps. If you zoom in here and you look at some of these parts of Detroit, there are whole neighborhoods where it's just wild, empty spaces. Look at this.
Yeah.
Whole streets where there's nothing on these streets. And then if you actually like plop in,
Into street view.
it's going to look like something out of Fallout here.
Yeah.
Look at this.
Yeah.
This is downtown Detroit.
Yeah.
They're like creating orchards.
It's like an orchard.
This looks like
growing.
rural Culpeper County to me.
Yeah.
You're inside a metropolitan area of millions of
this
people.
is what
Look
it
at
looks
this.
like when nature starts healing itself.
Look at this.
Yeah. Well, it is. There's orchards in places that used to be like urban areas, which again, I don't know is a bad thing, but certainly not what they intended. So
It looks like healing to me.
Somebody has joked and said the fastest growing industry in Detroit is agriculture.
Yeah. Oh my God.
The economic collapse that's faced Detroit, again, it went from being basically the Silicon Valley of the U.S. from the 1910s to 1950s to a bombed out, vacant, empty, patch
Selling
of
houses
rural
for
landscape.
$300, squatters, like it just, again, very overall devastating example of economic collapse within an area. All right, what's the next?
And again, archetype wise, Detroit is really just the embodiment of what's really hit the Rust Belt in general. You can see the same thing happened to Gary, Indiana. It happened to Cleveland, Youngstown. But again, we're using an example. Detroit's unique in that respect.
Yeah.
Now, we were hinting at some of the stuff talking about Detroit that also uniquely affects more recent cities. Detroit's population collapse has been going on since the 1950s, and it's been driven by economics. That's why we said Detroit is the embodiment of economic collapse. Well, that also leads immediately to population collapse as just its own thing. And I picked a more recent example of this, and that's San Francisco.
People leaving.
People have been leaving Detroit since the 60s,
Yeah.
but people have been leaving San Francisco since COVID.
Okay.
San Francisco has not experienced population collapse until post-2020. And now people are leaving in droves. San Francisco's population dropped by something like 8%.
Yeah, so this article is of March 2025, where it says the San Francisco region still leads the nation in population loss this decade. Wow, the very city that Gavin Newsom was once mayor.
Well, it's so sad because San Francisco was a beautiful city.
Yeah.
And it's situated in a beautiful spot. There is so much about it naturally that is beautiful. And yet, like, it's just not enough to hold people there anymore because it's so mismanaged and there's a lot of bat crap crazy people there.
I am old enough to remember because we Tina and I both grew up in Chico, California, which is a couple hours north of San Francisco. And I remember my grandparents would take me down to San Francisco, and you go to Fisherman's Wharf, and you might see like the firefighters memorial, and you go get your boat-in sourdough bread, which is excellent. And it was one of those things where you would have described San Francisco as being kind of quirky, maybe a little. I always say that the first step in a city's decline is whenever they start making shirts that say "Keep our city weird." It's like, okay, you're about to become just degenerate. But
don't worry, we're gonna get to that.
yeah, but San Francisco really has. I mean, go ahead and go through some of the numbers here.
So I mean, the Bay Area in general has lost a lot of people, but San Francisco, for example, it goes on to say that San Francisco's metro area grew an anemic 0.8% between July 2023 and July 2024. So you might be thinking, Christian,
that's not
population collapse. Yeah, but it's down 51,000 people from where it was before. Well, I guess like right when COVID was kicking off in April 2020. That's when the census numbers were finalized. So it's down 6%, 5.8% from 2020. And the cities, now they're saying, it's rebounded. We're growing again. When you compare this number to what's happening in other metro areas around the country, like even in other parts of California, San Jose, Sunnyvale saw 1.5% growth, which is also really bad. When you look at like the Sun Belt, Orlando, Houston, Raleigh, Dallas, Fort Worth, all these places are growing like 2%. But I mean, some of them are growing 9 to 10% compared to 2020. And San Francisco's down 6%. So obviously it's not on the same scale as Detroit's population. You know, Detroit's lost 2/3 of its population in 70 years, 60 years. But
so we've got
San Francisco is a modern embodiment of people are just leaving. They're moving out.
So we've got government mismanagement, crime, economic collapse, population collapse. What is our fifth characteristic?
So you were hinting at it earlier, and that is progressive insanity.
Just absolutely. And it's funny because you would have thought San Francisco would have been in the running for progressive insanity.
Oh, they are.
And it should be, but I don't think
you're the one that said keep X place weird. Well, X place, the original X place weird is Portland. That's where the phrase came from.
That was
right?
my guess. Before I actually got to that point in the outline, I was like, I'll bet it.
You wouldn't have been blamed for thinking Seattle might be a
they're up there.
second.
Remember, these are archetypes.
Second.
These are. I'm not saying that this is only unique. I could have chosen Seattle. I could have chosen San Francisco. The reason I chose the ones that I did was because San Francisco's lost a lot of people since COVID. So I felt like that they were a good representation of what's recently happened in the last 5 years. But Portland, I mean, they've definitely been keeping it weird, all right.
Portland's never been a beautiful city either. Like, there are some cities I can look at and go, that was a really beautiful city at one point. Not Portland. I've never seen Portland as a beautiful city.
Well, 100 years ago, it wasn't beautiful either. It was like a seedy, violent, seafaring port filled with a bunch of like transient dock workers that would get drunk and get
like
in
Seattle
fights.
used to be beautiful.
Well, to give you an idea, going all the way back to Bush Sr. So we're talking about like the early 90s, right? He was obviously vice president to Reagan, but when he comes president, it's the late 80s, early 90s. If I remember correctly, he referred to Portland as Little Beirut. So to give you an idea, like a lot of the insanity that you see in major metropolitan areas, a lot of the insanities that you see, like with the BLM riots that took place and whatnot, that sort of insanity was already being attributed to Portland back in the early 90s. So there was a lot of cities.
Speaking of insanity, Nick's absolute biggest fan lives in Portland.
my biggest troll. I live rent free in that guy's head, but honestly, I'm starting to think I'm going to charge him rent. So I'm going to charge him rent to live in his
So
head.
I chose Portland to describe progressive insanity because it really is an embodiment of what happens when progressivism has no brakes.
Unrestricted.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, there's no right-wing opposition in Portland. You can say whatever you want about the Proud Boys, right? Like there's no real like institutional government, right? You know, there's no Republican power base in Portland. It's the left runs the whole city without question, right? They just get to choose how left they want to go.
And it's not like they get pushback from the state. Right?
No, it's also,
like
they run the state. It's just like Chicago in the sense that they run Illinois. They don't have any opposition. And so they get to choose how left-wing they want to be. And we see the consequences of what happens when they choose to be very ultra left-wing. The city falls apart. You have a homeless epidemic. There's a drug epidemic everywhere. I mean, this news article that I've got pulled up here, and this is from a year ago, is that Oregon's decriminalization law is rolled back because of homelessness and overdose.
Yeah, how bad was it that liberal Oregon, which legalized, I mean, again, a lot of libertarians have argued for this, right? And I can remember having discussions with libertarians who I considered political allies and saying, I get theoretically what you want to do. You want to say that it's another government's job what I want to ingest. I said, the problem is that you have this massive welfare state and you have everything else to where I get it. You're arguing for personal responsibility. Unfortunately, we don't have a government system that actually rewards personal responsibility. If you allow for this, you're going to have upticks in crime. medical crises and all that people are going to be forced to pay for. Well, in Oregon, they're like, hogwash. We can do all this and it's going to be better. You'll see. And so they did. They decriminalized small amounts of illicit drugs from fentanyl to methamphetamine to crack at the same time that they were a sanctuary city, at the same time that they wanted to defund the police, at the same time that they wanted to allow for autonomous zones that be run by Antifa. And yeah, the result was that it got so bad that even people in Portland were like, okay, but can I please walk my kids to school without stepping on hypodermic needles? I don't mean to be like,
not to be
bigoted, right? But yeah. So progressive insanity. Portland definitely earns the title of progressive insanity. And look, if you want to avoid progressive insanity, what I would encourage you to do is more protein, and that's where Good Ranchers comes into effect. Ladies and gentlemen, Good Ranchers is not just a great company with a great product, but they're one that doesn't dump all over your values every 5 seconds. That's right. They believe that if they're going to be the sort of company that actually talks about having their values, then they better be the best in the marketplace. And I can tell you right now, we love Good Ranchers. We eat it almost every day. They have the best beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood delivered straight to your door with none of the antibiotics, no added hormones, no seed oils, none of that stuff. 100% American supply chain. And if you go to goodranchers.com and use my exclusive code NICK, N-I-C-K, when you check out, not only are you going to have $40 off of your order, but you're going to get free meat with your subscription. That means that in addition to the wonderful deliciousness that you will receive delivered to your door as part of your subscription, they're going to add on additional meat that you can enjoy. That could be hamburger. It could be bacon. Who knows? You got to go to the website and check it out. All I can say is that I pretty much had it all, and it's all delicioso. So goodranchers.com, promo code Nick. Go check it out. Support yourself. Support a great American-based company, and support a company that's willing to support a show like this, which I can promise you is not everybody. They are selective in who they support, and we're selective in who we support, and we love Good Ranchers, so go check them out. Okay.
So I think that these are the 5 traits that if you look at any city in the U.S. that's in crisis, I believe that it falls in at least one of these 5 categories. In many cases, it falls into multiple. Yeah. I said earlier in the podcast that one of these cities embodies almost all of these, and I would argue that's actually Detroit. Mm-hmm. They've seen population collapse. They've seen economic collapse, huge amounts of government mismanagement and corruption. Mm-hmm. A giant crime epidemic in Detroit. At one point, it was the murder capital of the United States, and it still is, near the top of the list. And I mean, the only thing that they're arguably missing is progressive insanity. They've run through the gauntlet of everything else.
They certainly have their fair share, but when you think of like overly
Rashida Tlaib, it represents the area, but again, like at the local level, that's probably the only thing they're missing. They've got the Democrat machine politics. They might not have yet gone full-blown wokeism, right? In the way that Portland, Oregon has just really gone full progressivism.
Being mayor of Detroit is another good way to eventually end up in jail, if you look at it.
But the point is that a lot of these cities, not just the ones that we've covered, but other ones like that we haven't covered, like New York City, for example, or Seattle, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, a lot of these cities.
Let's face it, you would be hard pressed to find any major metropolitan city within the United States that is not having serious issues with one or multiple of the categories we've just described.
I would argue that there's maybe a couple that have been able to avoid this, but they're all in Sunbelt Republican states, like Florida or Texas.
Sure, Jacksonville, maybe Dallas, Fort Worth.
Yeah, I mean, and even Jacksonville has a crime problem, but like it's pretty well run, in part because it's actually a Republican-leaning area. But the point is that these 5 categories, I believe, encompass pretty much all of the cities in the U.S. that are facing crisis. They fall within at least one of these 5 categories. In many cases, they fall within multiple of these categories. So now the question is, well, what actually created these problems, right? Why are these cities declining? Mm-hmm. And I came up with a brief list here that I just want to go through. And this is actually in some ways us analyzing the different perspectives here.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of fusing our traditional analysis with perspectives here because I kind of want your take on each of these to see if you think that these are applicable, particularly in the case of the cities that we just covered.
Yeah.
The 4 explanations that I see from all the research that I've done on this topic are deindustrialization, white flight, crime in general. I know that was also a cause, but
Yeah.
Also a cause and a symptom, believe it or not. And finally, Democrat mismanagement.
Mm-hmm.
And those are typically the 4 reasons that I see people across the spectrum that are given for why these cities are in crisis.
Sure. Well, I mean, let's go into deindustrialization first. I think it's hard to argue. Look, a city can have some form of industry that is not focused on manufacturing. So like Silicon Valley, right? Obviously at the same point where a lot of cities in the United States, especially within the Rust Belt, Detroit kind of being chief among them, but there's others as well, Cincinnati, Cleveland, stuff
Youngstown,
like that.
Pittsburgh.
So you had all these cities that were essentially suffering from deindustrialization. So a lot of these industries were being moved. They were getting better labor rates overseas. And again, it's important to understand too, because there's a lot of emphasis on, it was all bad free trade policy. Well, no, it wasn't free trade policy as much as it was a combination of factors. One, you had really destructive union contracts that were just completely unreasonable. You had union contracts that were signed with like certain auto manufacturers and whatnot that were signed when essentially the United States auto industry had no real international competition. And then when international competition came on to the marketplace, all of a sudden, these contracts were not sustainable. And rather than allow renegotiation, it literally drove certain elements of the U.S. auto industry into a ditch. And so we have to take accountability for things that were a result of U.S. policy, but then were also a result of really, really bad trade policy. And we can go back into the whole problem with monetary policy.
The Triffin dilemma. All that.
Yeah. So all that factors in. But there's no question that if you have a large urban area that has been built up around certain sectors of the economy, largely manufacturing, and then that manufacturing leaves, what's to replace it? And what it makes it so devastating on a city is that obviously you have a lot of construction, you have a lot of material resources, you have a lot of other things that go into the creation of a city. You have a lot of infrastructure. And when the purpose for that infrastructure goes away, when it leaves and it's not replaced,
the infrastructure falls apart.
And
the tax base to maintain the infrastructure, like that's the problem that really hit Detroit, because it's like population's moving out, the jobs are moving out, and the factories are closing. Well, that means that the city government, even if they were run by conservatives, like we were talking about Democrat mismanagement, obviously a problem that Detroit had is that they had, Democrats running the city into the ground at the same time that this problem was going on. But I would argue that in some ways, yes, Detroit made its own problems worse in terms of, its political choices. But even if you had, staunch conservatives that were doing their that were anti-corruption, that were careful with taxes and government expenses, the city still would have declined. Well, because of the fact that there would not have been enough money to maintain the infrastructure.
Yeah, the city didn't. So obviously, cities exist for a reason, and they generally exist because they're a hub of trade, right? Multiple people come there, and in order to engage in some sort of trade or commerce, they become the focal point, and then they grow as a result. And if they have a booming industry associated with it, that naturally attracts people to come for opportunities, work, not to mention just for the industry itself, but then there's all kinds of other industries, service-related industries, which rise up in order to service the new population coming for the primary industry. So when the primary industry leaves and people leave as a result, the restaurants and, the tailors and the auto mechanics and everything else that was associated with that also has to leave as a result. And you're left with all this crumbling infrastructure, both for the reasons that there aren't enough people to actually justify it, nor is there a tax base. Now, one of the problems that you see, and this kind of falls within the mismanagement component, is that when you're a city and you're bustling and you're booming and you have a lot of industry or whatever else it is, there is a tendency, as you see the wealth associated with that industry, to then want to take on more and more social programs. And what ends up happening with those social programs is they require a large tax base in order to sustain them. Well, if you are living off of the industry, so if you are heavily reliant on taxing the very industries which provide the wealth, you disincentivize industries from coming into your jurisdiction. And so one of the things that needs to be understood about deindustrialization is that it is very, very easy to blame outside factors. But if you're going to be elected to run a city, it is incumbent upon you and the city council to not simply be arguing on how you divvy up the wealth which exists, right? The redistribution component, but it's also to be forward looking on, hey, what sort of industries make our population center possible? What sort of infrastructure do we need to invest in? What sort of infrastructure do we need to maybe put off? All of these factors.
Or allow for the private sector to handle.
Or more importantly, allow for the private sector, because here's the other big thing that happens is that a lot of times citizens of a city will be frustrated. Why don't we have X? And they'll say, well, the private sector isn't producing X, therefore the government sector should produce it. And the end result is you need to ask the question, why is the private sector not producing it? Because the private sector is generally doing analysis on what is the feasibility of this being a profitable enterprise. Now, there's all kinds of arguments that can be made that there are certain things which are public good parks or whatnot that don't necessarily have a profitability made. I don't want to debate that right now, but let's just say that typically when cities are focusing on more things having to do with like transportation infrastructure, sewer, water, power, things of that nature, whether they're doing it internal to the city or through public-private partnerships, or they're allowing for private provision of it, you generally are less likely to have big government boondoggles which can tank your city budget. But the moment the city is now responsible for doing all these nice, grandiose sounding things that the private sector isn't already doing, the more you realize that you're setting yourself up for future financial difficulties. And this is something that always requires forward-thinking people, and forward thinking, which denies voters what they want in the next election cycle, don't tend to keep their seats. And I think when you look at the deindustrialization, when you look at any major metropolitan area that has become dependent on a particular sector of the economy, which then parasitically lives off of that productive sector of the economy, what ends up happening is other cities in different places tempt away your industry. You're seeing this with Silicon Valley in the Bay Area right now. You've actually seen it with elements of Hollywood. You saw it with manufacturing, which happened as a result of multiple factors. But you will inevitably have politicians that run on this kind of Mamdani idea of, well, look at all the wealthy people over there. I'm going to punish them and equally distribute it to you. And then the wealthy people are like, well, if I'm going to be the target, if I'm going to be the bad guy in all of your stories, I'll just leave. And then they take the wealth, and then the tax base collapses. And what you end up finding is that all the people screaming around going, oh, the rich don't pay their fair share. You end up finding out, regardless of what you think their fair share should have been, you know who they were paying a lot more taxes than? You.
So
and the end result is, for some of this stuff is, look, don't shoot the messenger, but it's not the poor people paying the vast majority of taxes in order to maintain the infrastructure and the police force and everything else. And so deindustrialization happens for a variety of reasons, but one of the primary ones that takes place every single time, the one that they can't have control over, is when you end up getting these cities, which, again, instead of having a symbiotic relationship with the industry that makes them possible, they end up engaging in a parasitic relationship with that industry, and they end up leaving.
So I want to unpack that just a little bit more, because some of the stuff that you said there, I think, leads to another common reason that I see popping up, and that's white flight. Some people might not know what that term is. It's an academic term to describe white residents of a city. This happened a lot in the 50s to 70s in the U.S. You had a lot of these cities, older cities. Detroit is an example, actually. I'll bring up the population statistics here to show what I mean. You had a lot of white residents of cities in, say, the 50s to 70s that moved out of the cities into the suburbs or just elsewhere. And so the white population of these cities collapsed, and they were the ones that were running the city previously and that had the money and kind of maintained the city, and then moving out turned them basically into ghettos. And so if you look at the population history of Detroit here, one of the things that's interesting is, let me pop this open. You see that in 1910, Detroit was 98% white. In 1920, it was 95%. It slowly declined, but I mean, as late as 1940, it was 90% white, almost 91% white. And then it started to change with what's called the Great Migration. You started to have a lot of blacks from the South that, during like the Jim Crow era, they moved to northern states, and obviously they weren't moving to like rural Indiana because there weren't any jobs there. So they were going to cities, and Detroit was one of these cities. And so beginning in the 1940s, really in the 1930s, you started to see a lot of black migration into places like Chicago and Detroit. And previously these cities were effectively 100% white, close to it. Well, what you noticed is that Detroit's population here peaks in 1950 at 1.8 million. That's really the height of Detroit. And if you look at the population growth, I mean, it was steady all the way up until 1950. And after 1950, Detroit starts to decline. Well, that correlates very strongly with the white population in Detroit falling off a cliff. In 1950, it was at 83.6%. In 1970, it was 55%.
Well, it's also important to remember that in 1960...
Well, 1960, it was 70%. And then by 1970, and it's really post-60s that Detroit really starts to decline. So you see that it goes from 83% white in 1950, which is the height of Detroit. It's like one of the richest places in America, to by the time the 1970s or 80s roll, I mean, look at the fall off between 70 and 80. Well, and just the raw population, like the number of white residents in Detroit went from 838,000 to 400,000 in just 10 years from 1970 to 80. That's like the city's imploding at that point.
And just so people properly understand this, there's a couple of things that happen, right? It's not that, so you had a lot of people moving from the South, black people moving from the South, fleeing Jim Crow states to come to the North to find economic opportunities in Detroit, which was, booming. And then in the 1960s, well, first of all, you had a rash of what would be considered at the time progressive Democrat mayors, combined with the very, very progressive Lyndon Johnson administration. And they had this great cities project that they were going to do. And this was also kind of in line with major infrastructure projects. And some of this did lead to an increase in the suburbs. And so it's not as if white flight was they left Detroit and then moved to Indiana, right?
They moved to Oakland County.
They moved to the suburbs, right? They moved outside of the city. And a lot of the infrastructure money and a lot of the federal funding that was coming in was actually facilitating this. And they were engaging in various projects that cut up various communities. So there are areas of Detroit where you used to have
very walkable urban,
this idea of you could live in one place, walk to your school, walk to your grocery store, walk to your church, walk to downtown. And then when they started carving up the city through these massive infrastructure projects,
highways
mainly, it really kind of subdivided and broke up Detroit in a way that previously had not existed. Now,
I would argue in retrospect that was a terrible decision. If you look at the old aerial photos of Detroit from, say, 1950 versus today, I would want to live in 1950s Detroit because you could live 10 blocks out of downtown and walk to downtown and be safe and not have to like cross major highways. Like there's something about if you have a major 6-lane highway between your house and downtown, you're probably going to not be walking to downtown that often.
It's going to impact your property values. It's going to impact the way that you interact with your immediate surroundings. And again, there was a whole rash of urban planning that was taking place in the 60s and whatnot. And again, this was not a bunch of conservatives pushing this in Detroit. You had Democrat mayor, Democrat president, Democrat planners, redistribution, all of this. And Detroit was one of the cities that most embraced the whole
urban renewal projects, which actually kind of destroyed the city.
Yeah, the urban renewal projects. And the fascinating thing is that, again, you will now see this issue where they will say, if the whites if the whites are there, it's a problem. If they leave, it's white flight. And if they come back, it's gentrification. Yeah. So it's kind of,
damned if you do.
Yeah, they get them coming and going. But the other problem too, and so you have this concept of white flight. And another way to put it is not so much white flight, because here's the other thing that needs to be understood, is that it was more income flight. So at the time, you obviously had white people that had the higher incomes within Detroit, but it's not as if they were the only ones going to the suburbs when they could. Right? You had a lot of people moving to the suburbs when they reached an economic status that made it possible. So what does that mean? Tax base flight. So when the people that you rely upon for your tax base decide that it's no longer advantageous to live in your city, it's no longer economically viable, socially viable, or whatnot, they leave. Well, what's one of the things that draw them out? One of it's taxes. One of it's looking for a better, more rural style community or suburb style community. The other is crime. And one of the things that you see in all of these areas that accompanies progressivism is a different way to look at enforcing laws. And so the more progressive your district attorneys, Commonwealth attorneys, mayors, city councils, police force, police leadership, the more they get, the more they take this kind of laissez-faire attitude toward crime, whereas crime is a result of conditions. It's not a result of you engaging in a criminal act. It's a result of conditions. And so when crime takes place, it's because society has failed the criminal, not because the criminal is, essentially aggressed against a law-abiding citizen. Now, what makes this attractive on some level is that you can actually commiserate with the hungry person stealing bread. You might be able to even commiserate with the person that, through no fault of their own, lost their job or got sick or found themselves in economic circumstances where, they feel desperate. But the moment you take the attitude that crime is justified because of conditions, you encourage more crime. Like, that's the one thing you can't get around. The moment you allow for crime, the moment you justify crime, the moment you encourage it. Because only a sucker works hard to achieve something that somebody else is now permitted to just take. And unfortunately, look, if progressives can figure out a way to fight crime while creating conditions that elevate people and whatever, fine. But they haven't figured out how to do it. And the more progressive a city becomes, the more crime they're generally willing to tolerate, the more people will vote with their feet. And that's where you see a lot of the flight coming. But there is no question that when you look at crime, cities are the primary location for it. Our friend Brian Callen, I don't know if it's still true today, but at the time when he said it, he was talking about gun violence. And he goes, it's fascinating. People always talk about gun violence in the United States. And yes, we have more guns and therefore we have more violence that are used with guns. He goes, but if you take out the 5 major metropolitan cities or the 5 highest crime, we drop from like the top, whatever it is, 20 in gun crime to like 180 in gun crime. And again, one can't help but wonder if these cities said, look, we're going to be as progressive as we want, except with crime. How would that impact their cities? Would more people be willing to put up with the taxes if they actually felt that you were keeping them safe? And one of the things that we pointed out before, when you look at flight from places like Los Angeles or San Francisco, is or even Chicago at one point, is that they had high taxes. They were liberal. They had a lot of other stuff that would be considered socially liberal. But insofar as they were willing to keep crime under control and build decent roads, people were willing to put up with it. But now what they're increasingly asked to do is you have to pay more taxes and you have to put up with more crap. And we're not going to deal with the homelessness issue. We're not going to deal with the crime issue because that's all your fault too, because you don't pay enough in taxes. Well, at some point, even the liberal progressive that likes these ideas theoretically picks up and moves. The question is whether or not they take the policies with them. And all of that, again, comes back to, because here's the other thing I don't think we can get away with. With very few exceptions, every single major metropolitan city in this country, with very few exceptions, and some of them notable, Giuliani in New York City is a good example of this, have been exclusively run by progressively more progressive mayors for decades. The idea of the vast majority of major metropolitan cities blaming their problems on Republican governance is absurd, because from their city councils to their school boards, to their ombudsmen, to their mayors, to their police chiefs, almost exclusively for at least 40 years, in some cases 60 or 70, have almost exclusively been run by Democrats. Richmond, Virginia has had one period of time, since Reconstruction. We're in the 1800s now, people. We're not talking decades now. We're talking century plus.
That's a common thing in the South.
Right, where a Republican has run Richmond, and a Republican was mayor of Richmond for one, I think, brief 2-year period, because the actual mayor of Richmond, I think, had to step down for criminal charges. The Republican vice mayor was put in there. to finish out the term, immediately lost re-election, and a Democrat was put right back in turn. So how are you going to claim in any one of these major cities, well, you know who's to blame for all this? Republicans.
Yeah, they perpetually misdiagnose the problem. And what they do is, instead of dealing with what's causing the symptom, they will come up with bright ideas like, we're going to tax you on your way out. Like as you leave, because our policies are so bad and our tax rates so high and it's just awful, we're going to penalize you on your way out so that you can leave some money with us to misuse.
Yeah. And even, again, you'll see this all the time where people will talk about, well, blue states actually subsidize the red states, or actually the highest violence is in red states. It is almost, if you were to take out the blue run areas in red states, that the statistics would alter drastically. So I don't see how anybody who's willing to look at this reasonably can come to the conclusion the Democrats have done a good job running cities in America, and yet they keep getting reelected over and over and over again, to where the entire Overton window within a city, there is no Republican option. Right? Again, Giuliani was the last Republican option within New York City. And if you look at what happened in New York City from his tenure, you can't come to the conclusion that it wasn't a safer, wealthier, cleaner place. Right? Anybody that was living there can't not fail to come to that conclusion. And yet they have picked progressively more liberal, and now they're on the verge of electing a communist.
Yeah.
So
I want to read something briefly from this guy who runs a Substack called Liberal Patriot. He's on the left, but he has some really interesting takes where he's criticizing the Democratic Party in particular after 2024. And he talks about, he has this article that he put out at the beginning of the year titled "The Democrats' Governance Problem."
Yeah.
And he emphasizes, he's like saying governance is key, but for some reason they're not really handling it. And here's the part that I want to show you. He's quoting another left-leaning commentator named Noah Smith. And he says that, you've probably heard of him. He's prominent on Twitter. He says this: in the late 2010s, blue cities brought a problem on themselves, urban disorder. Crime rates began rising in 2015, fueled by national unrest, but blue cities didn't respond by cracking down on crime as they did in the 90s and 2000s. Progressives in the late 2010s reviled and rejected stop and frisk, broken windows policing, and other tools that blue cities had used to keep order in previous decades. Instead, they elected a bunch of progressive prosecutors, enacted more permissive policies towards public drug use, passed laws that made it hard to use violence against shoplifters, and sometimes even reduced penalties for minor crimes. The result was entirely predictable. Blue cities became increasingly afflicted by pervasive, low-level urban disorder, drug needles in children's parts, epidemics and car break-ins, and so on. Female friends of mine in San Francisco, see, it's not just Detroit, right? Yeah. Started to report being followed for blocks, harassed on the train, or even slapped in the head by people on their way to work. The housing crunch made the disorder much worse, and of course was exacerbating homelessness. Then the pandemic and the riots hit, and the trend got turbocharged. Without eyes on the street to deter crime, and with police crowded or disgruntled with police cowed or disgruntled by the protest of summer 2020, progressive cities became increasingly lawless, chaotic zones. Violent crime soared in 2020 to 2021 with waves of attacks on vulnerable persons like Asian elders. Many progressives believe that any actions to curb urban disorder, restrictions on sidewalk tents, making people pay for public transit, arresting people for nonviolent crime, and so on, represent the exclusion of marginalized people from public life. In the absence of a full cradle-to-grave welfare state, progressives think they can redistribute urban utility from the rich to the poor by basically letting anyone do anything they want. This guy's on the left, and he's pointing out
we saw this
what everybody now realizes.
We saw this too with Fareed Zakaria on Bill Maher. Again, Fareed Zakaria is on the left. He's a CNN guy. So this is what he said to Bill Maher. And we won't play the video. I'll just read it off. He goes, no, this is a huge Democrat Party problem. If you look at Democratic cities, they are terribly run. They have incredibly high taxes. It is impossible to build, so the cost of housing. And then he goes, let me finish. I'll give you a chance. He's talking to Rahm Emanuel, who used to be the mayor of Chicago. The cost of housing is crazy in places like New York and Chicago. If you look at Democratic states, you go to look at New York versus Florida. Roughly the same population. The budget of New York State is twice that of Florida. What do they have? Streets paved with gold? I live in New York. I pay the highest taxes in New York. You get nothing for it. And I think that this is the image people have of the Democratic Party. Lots of taxes, lots of regulations, but nothing gets done. And I think Democrats have to own this and realize the answer to everything is not more taxes or more regulation. People are fed up with that and they feel like it isn't working. Correct. But the problem is when they say it isn't working, they don't ask the question, well, anything that has been done for decades on end is working for someone. It's just not working for the residents, right? It may be working very, very well for the people that
the politicians and their staff and
the politicians, the staff, the
activists,
the NGOs, they get cuts of city budgets or the wealth redistribution that takes place. If you're someone that's poor, and look, let's face it, we have massive welfare traps in this country. When you disincentivize work, but you pay people to sit at home, what you're really doing is paying them to vote for the people that keep the money coming from the people that are working. And it used to be that people would, how can you be so heartless? We're talking about single mothers. We're talking about the disabled. And now people are looking around going, yeah, no, we're not. All right. We have a major political party in this country, which has super, super rich people on one side that live far away from the devastation of what's happening in these cities. And then you have super, super poor people that it's not that they can't work. They don't got to. Their job is voting for the politicians that take from people who do work and give to them. And you're having this whole sector of the middle class that is looking at this. You saw this. I remember when Oliver Anthony, right? Oliver Anthony did a song, Richmond, North of Richmond. And now look, we can argue about, some of the, but he has this line in it because I saw some people going on, yes, he's raging against capitalism. There is a line in that where he says, he talks about people milking welfare. And then he goes, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Like he is clearly, again, he's not a rich guy. He's part of what we might call kind of the disaffected working class white male, right? He's slamming people that could work but refuse to because they can just get paid to not. But that money comes from somewhere, and the people that are working really hard and feel like they can't make ends meet realize that, okay, I'm part of the person that this system is feeding off of. And there is a part of hopelessness. Milton Friedman actually talks about this in Free to Choose, where he goes, look, I don't blame a person who realizes they can make more on welfare than working. I blame the people that create conditions where you make more on money on welfare than you do working. And there's no question that Democrat cities, progressive politics, have created this sort of circumstance. Now, and kind of the final analysis here.
Yeah, what to do about this?
What do we do about this? I think that, look,
Tina's going to be upset because we're going to go over time, but
well,
it's
no,
fine.
look, the deindustrialization, some of these problems are long-term, right? If you've had companies like just flee your city because they don't want to do business there, it's going to take a while for them to actually believe that you're a good place to do business again. And there's a whole variety of factors that people look at when I'm setting up an entrepreneurial endeavor. And some of it's your tax rates, some of it's your regulatory policy, some of it's your infrastructure, some of it's your education. Do I have a workforce that wants to come there, that wants to be able to do whatever it is that I'm offering in the form of jobs, right? Can I reasonably rely on the fact that once I have my factory built and I'm doing things, you're not going to change the tax code on me and screw me over, right? These are things that entrepreneurs look at before they invest. And there's a reason why long-term enterprises are leaving certain states and saying, it isn't worth it anymore. If that city then says, oh, never mind, we're sorry. No, you don't get that person back. You might be able to keep some of the people that are considering leaving, but you're probably not getting anybody that is now reinvested in an entirely different state. So when it comes to deindustrialization, you got problems. Why? Because you set a precedent that said you were going to have a parasitic relationship with business. And so now business doesn't want to be anywhere near you. That's it. Bottom line. You're going to probably have to change that over. You're going to have to show a cultural shift in the way that you run your city. Good luck. Now, the one that I think that you could actually, and not only that, but even if you did start to do that, even if you did start to say, no, we're going to be business friendly, we're going to give all kinds of tax breaks, which, has its own problems. But even if they made overtures to business, you want to know what the other problem is? Why do I want to move my business to a place where you have a huge crime problem and you refuse to address it? If you're one of these crazy liberal cities like Portland or San Francisco or Los Angeles, and you are so in the bag for woke ideology, that even if you give me all the tax breaks I want, even if I can find people willing to do the work, if somebody comes and robs my store or burns my factory to the ground, you're going to be sitting there side by side with them, cheering them on as opposed to punishing them. Why would I make the investment? But here's the thing. And this is why I think what's going on in DC right now is so critical to watch. And this is another one of those areas where, again, I don't chalk up everything Donald Trump does to, 5D chess. But I honestly think the law enforcement takeover of DC could quite possibly be 5D chess. And the reason why is this. There is no major city in America right now that I know of that is actually willing to give a hardcore conservative a chance on running the city. It's become socially unacceptable to elect someone like a Rudy Giuliani in New York, no matter how bad it gets, right? No matter how bad it gets. But now we have this incredibly unique scenario where Donald Trump, who is no question a law and order guy, Donald Trump can constitutionally take over law enforcement in DC and turn around the crime situation and do it very, very quickly. Because here's the other thing that progressives don't seem to understand. When you're weak on crime, you attract crime. People engage in crime because there's an economic benefit. And when you say you're weak on it, criminals say that's a good place to do crime. By contrast, when you say we will punish you relentlessly, yes, if you take the iPhone, we're giving you a felony. Well, you can say all day long, well, is that a little too much for the crime? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you know what people also learn? Holy crap, dude. Getting a felony for doing something that one county over won't even get me prosecuted. Where are you going to stay? Are you going to stay in the place that cracks down on crime, or are you going to go to the place that essentially ignores it? You know who also votes with their feet? Criminals. And if you're the sort of city that cracks down on crime, they leave. And what Donald Trump is about to demonstrate in DC is that none of this is as hard as leftists have made it out to be. And here's what I think is going to happen in a number of cities. Now, Trump has already suggested that he might use the National Guard to go in and enforce this in other places. That remains to be seen. But what is about to be seen and what is already being seen in places like DC is no matter how much they shop in or bus in white liberal protesters to march through DC talking about the heavy hand of Trump policies and fascism, the people that live in DC are noticing, yeah, it's cleaner and safer. And maybe they don't go to their little cocktail parties and talk about how great they think it is. But when they go into the voting booth, because I got to tell you right now, if you would have asked the man on the street interviews, if you would have asked the Saturday Night Live crowd, if you would have asked, the hoity-toity rich progressives in Manhattan, who was voting for Rudy Giuliani, they all would, I have no idea. I can't believe how mean he is with stop and frisk. He got elected somehow. And I think what Donald Trump is going to demonstrate in DC is that it's not that hard. You actually don't need perpetual heavy-handed policing across the board. What you do need is to get your city under control in order to set a new paradigm so that everybody understands new sheriff in town. And yes, that initial phase of the new sheriff in town process, that usually takes some time to establish. That usually does take what we might consider to be heavy-handed policing tactics. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you get the crime problem under control, all of a sudden people start to really look at it as, well, you know what? That might be a good place to invest. Because at least I'm not going to have my factory burned down. And in a low crime area, you actually have people that are attracted to move there for opportunities. So that might be a good investment opportunity. It might be a good place to actually set up industry. It might be a good place to open up a restaurant. It might be a good place to open up a shop. The more you get of that, it's self-perpetuating. Now what do you have? Well, you have a bigger tax base. Now you have more money that you can actually spend on things outside of law and order. But the law and order comes first. And I think that's what's going to end up happening in Washington, D.C. The question will be, as everybody is watching this, and let's face it, the Democrats have once again taken the bait. They have once again said, oh, this is going to be so heavy. This is going to be horrible. This is going to exacerbate the problem. They've said this with everything Trump has done. And like every single time they've been wrong. And when they're wrong again, the question will be will people in other cities that have been plagued by crime, will the people of St. Louis, Missouri, will the people look at that and be like, you know what? Enough is enough. I'm tired of being told that, the reason why there's such high crime in this area is because of, these underlying economic conditions and socioeconomic bull crap. The reason why my community is crap is because that guy's a drug dealer and he kills people in order to protect his turf, and you won't arrest him. Or when you do arrest him, you give him a simple possession charge and then you let him back out. Because, we don't want people with simple possession. No, that guy's a drug dealer. People are dying as a result of it. There's gang violence. Take care of the gang. Well, it's just a 16-year-old. Okay, but the 16-year-old kid is murdering my 14-year-old kid that just wants to go to school. So as much as we want to commiserate about how horrible it is that a 16-year-old who grew up without a dad in the home, it is now in a gang, if you really want to stop that, we can talk about dealing with the 16-year-old and the troubling conditions in which he was raised once he is off the street and doesn't have a gun in hand killing my 14-year-old. Then we can start to create conditions where people actually feel okay about raising families in this particular area. And then the more families we have, and the more industry we have, and the bigger tax base we have, and the more opportunities that we have, it can get better. But it's not going to get better as long as that guy is still committing acts of violence and doing so free from prosecution. That's going to be the question that major metropolitan areas in this country are going to have to ask themselves. And I'm going to tell you right now, the more progressive, and look, predominantly the more progressive white liberals you put in charge of your place, but more progressive anything, right? It doesn't get better when it's a person of color who's a progressive liberal. They have demonstrated over multi-decades now, they cannot maintain law and order. They cannot properly run a city. Because that's the first, guys, can we just agree on something? Before government exists to do anything else, it exists for purposes of law and order. And if there's one thing progressives and woke progressives have demonstrated is they're incapable of doing it. So stop trusting them with it. Donald Trump's about to give you an example of what works. We'll see if voters are smart enough to replicate it in the cities that desperately need it. All right. Well, we've gone just a bit over, but we're staying pretty close to the hour. Once again, thank you all for joining us. If you are interested in being part of our pregame or postgame, because as many of you know, the show doesn't end right now. The show just goes into postgame with our audience members. And if you would like to be a member of our community, please check out the link in the description. We would love to see you. By the way, the next time you see a podcast of Making the Argument, we will be in our brand new studio. So signing off for the last time for the studio that we've called home for almost 3 years now. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.